You don't want spiraling negativity and ascribing motives to be characteristic of your conflict interactions, because this is what escalates conflict and it becomes a major impediment to being able to process through it. So let's look at some of these in detail. Ascribing motives is where we think we know why the other person thinks what they think or believe what they believe, or we know their motivations behind it and what they really are thinking, what they really are feeling, and why they're talking the way they're talking. And the thing is, we can't really know that. We can't truly know the other person, and so ascribing motives is at best a guess. And oftentimes it's a negative thing that we're engaging in. We're not thinking the best of intentions from the other person. We're usually thinking the worst of intentions from the other person. Also, counter blame is another escalation trigger in which you start blaming the other person for everything going wrong. And this is what actually develops something called issue development. And there are 3 stages in issue development. It's naming, blaming, and claiming. And naming is where you name the problem. And then this is where you get into blame and counter blame, where you blame somebody for that problem. And what happens is you have one person blame, and then because they got blamed, they're going to turn right back around, or they're going to reciprocate it, right? They're going to blame the other person, and so it's a back and forth until finally at some point in time within conflict interaction, there's usually claiming that occurs. That is, salience occurs. We at some point think one person, one entity is to blame, and we accept that. And it could be that one person accepts the blame at some point because they're just ready for the conflict to end, whether or not they actually think that they're to blame. And it may be that there's shared blame, but it's difficult to get to when you start going through the process of counter-blaming. You also can demand withdrawal from the other person. And when you do that, that escalates a conflict because it demands that the other person disengage, not process through what they're feeling, what they're thinking at the moment. You have different aspects of spiraling negativity, which include dehumanization. That is, you don't even attribute human-like qualities to the other person anymore. You almost make them animal-like, or with a complete disregard for their care or the fact that they would have authenticity. You engage in name calling, so you have ad hominem attacks where you call the other person names that would degrade them and demoralize them. You engage in polarizing language, which is us versus them language, where you create 2 sides of the fence, so to speak. And I hear this quite often, and it can be very frustrating because it just exasperates the fact that there's separation socially between people, and it usually increases that social separation. Then you have engaged verbal intensity, where you started doing things like cussing at the other person, and then you can even engage in nonverbal intensity, where you have yelling and staring and those aggressive tactics that we talked about before. Stubbornness is also an escalation trigger in which you're not willing to give up your ground. And so what does it matter what the other person says or does? Because you're not willing to budge. Even if you're not willing to budge, the conflict is going to continually escalate. Friedman and Carell, actually, they pinpoint a number of different escalation triggers which overlap with some of these that are talked about in your textbook. They talk about the use of aggressive tactics, much like some of these things that we just talked about a moment ago. They also talk about changes in view of the other person. When you no longer see the other person as your friend, when you no longer see the other person as your intimate romantic partner, when you no longer see the other person as a family member, when you no longer see the other person as a coworker that you can trust. So when you change your view of the other person, then that is very difficult because that escalates the conflict. Makes it easier for you to say and do things that you wouldn't have said or done otherwise. Weakened interpersonal bonds is also an escalation trigger. And when a conflict starts to escalate, that is going to usually weaken the interpersonal bonds between people because they're frustrated. They will start to question the longevity and the ongoing nature of their interpersonal relationship. And it's easier at that point to then engage in those aspects of escalation that we talked about, like ascribing motives, counterblaming. Then finally, you have problem being difficult to resolve. Some problems are just complex. They are intricate, they're multifaceted, they've been building up over time. And to think that you could sit down and resolve them in one conversation, or maybe even over a few days or a few weeks, is probably unrealistic. For example, intimate partners that have been together for a number of years, like family members, or a romantic relationship that's long-term. If you have a really complex problem, you're not going to sit down and solve it overnight. It's probably going to take a long time. Most people aren't committed to that kind of time. And when problems are difficult to resolve and they can't resolve it quickly and easily, then it usually triggers escalation in the relationship. Escalation is problematic. What you want is de-escalation, but at times that can be very difficult. At times you might even find yourself going to a third party that can help you deal with the conflict. In school, many of you might have experienced in your secondary education peer counselors and peer conflict management. Unfortunately, we don't have that at SFA. However, if you live in the dorms, oftentimes you have your RAs, your resident advisors, you have also dormitory advisors that would help to oversee a conflict between roommates. You might have a professor that would help to oversee a conflict between classmates. You have the judicial officer on campus that helps to oversee conflict between professors and their students. I mean, there's lots of different third parties that you can go to and that you may have gone to in the past in order to receive assistance with a conflict. And there are two primary types of third parties that you can go to, a mediator and an arbiter. But many people confuse the difference between these two entities, and so we need to clarify.